So we had to stop filming this for a moment because our child is punk and she woke up. Well, didn't even wake up. She just got up to come see what we were doing because we were talking, and she has to join in the fun. So we stopped that for a moment. So really, I think the continuation, I think would be even more interesting because I think that the debate whether Christianity and science, maybe science has done some more things that is betterment, but to society as a whole. But on the other hand, there are certainly negative
It's
things that
hard to
we could.
beat penicillin.
Well, it's hard to beat penicillin, which is why I guess they haven't made any new antibiotics in what, 60 years or some such nonsense.
Well, there's probably market forces in play there. But they did recently discover a pretty good antibiotic, I believe, just by scooping some mud up, and they were able to culture bacteria which they had never been cultured before. And from that, they discovered a pretty good new antibiotic. And this is all very breaking news, so it'll have to go through trials and all that sort of thing. But I do think there are some new antibiotics out there. And but to sort of get back on to our original debate, um, I do believe, and I want to say this, that religion brings people great peace of mind and brings out the best in many people. I,
It gives the drive to
to do
be a better
good.
person, to do good. Because unfortunately, I do believe that there are people out there that if they did not have some kind of, you know, something to hold them accountable, which obviously you could say, oh, the law, the law can hold you accountable, blah, 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 but, whatever. If they didn't have something to hold them accountable, then they probably would not, you know,
But
morally follow a good
but
path.
here's the kicker.
Tell
If
me the
I could
kicker.
if I
You
could
tell
have
me.
the Pope say a prayer for me, say I've got I don't know, dengue fever or something, or I can have a medical hospital provide real deal medical care, I'm taking the hospital every single time, and I think 95% of people would. So
Well, I
science
would.
isn't necessarily better than religion. I'm not arguing that. It's more effective and it does what it says it can do.
Okay, but I would do that too. I would do that too. I mean, I wouldn't mind having both because I'm all about covering all ends there. But I'm not saying I wouldn't go because I certainly would.
Of course.
But see, I guess the difference is that I would look at it as a Christian that the doctor was given the tools by God to be able to perform what he did, just like I believe that would be the
But
case
that's
with.
just a rhetorical trick to say, well, doctors perform great miracles, but that's only because God allows them to do so. Well, if I could prove that God didn't necessarily allow them to perform great works, then you could then just argue, well, he created the earth, and therefore, they can only do what they do because, you can always step back
But I'm
another
not saying that. I'm not saying
uh,
it's because he
order of magnitude and say, well, it's really God, it's the God of the gaps argument.
yeah, but I'm not saying he allows it. I'm saying, if he makes you, right, if he created you, then by that effect, then you would have, once you went to medical school and got your degree and then you became some great doctor that saved lives, then by virtue of the fact that he actually, uh, made you,
And here's the other thing.
you know,
It's interesting. I look back historically. Now, initially, there was a great confluence between science and religion.
mm-hmm.
Many of the early scientists were
Galileo,
were in fact religious
right?
people. Copernicus, Sir Isaac Newton, no less. You know, it's in the more modern times that this so-called rift has appeared, and of course Darwin had a lot to do with that, and the Big Bang Theory.
Mm-hmm.
I think these scientific theories are seen as encroaching upon things that typically religion has claimed for itself. How did the universe get started? Where did people come from? Why was life created? So when science comes along, so when scientists were doing things that religion was okay with, it was fine. But now that they're coming along and saying, well, there might actually be scientific laws, natural laws that can explain things that religion claims to have the ultimate explanation for, it creates a problem for religious thinkers because, again, all religion is based on the past, on divine revelation. So once you start knocking some of the blocks out, there's nothing to replace them with. Whereas science, on the other hand, can always create a new block.
But it's, and that's another thing too. When you talk about it, what is it? God created the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day He rested, right? But really, and I think we've spoke about this before, right? Whereas it depends upon how you look at it, because the Bible is supposed to have been written by, inspired by God, but written by man. So we know that man has fallacy, that he makes mistakes. So by that, if if you look at the Bible, 7 days is something that would be feasible to a human being, 7 days. But what would that be to God? What would a day be to God, So,
Apparently about a billion years.
well, right, and that's what I'm saying. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to look at the Bible. I guess if people are very literal and they have to actually look at it and it has to be, oh no, it's got to be this. It's got to be 6 days, and on the seventh day He rested. And there can't be any kind of openness for interpretation, and it must be this way. It has to be this way. And, a billion years cannot mean a day. Then I think that's where people run into the problem. That's why you're finding such, whereas it wasn't like that before, like with Galileo and all of them. Now you're finding this big riff, right?
That's certainly a rift. Well, I think there are certain people in both the science camp and the religious camp that like to stoke the fires, so to speak. They've sort of made their bones on the idea that I battle the atheist scientist, or I stand up against the oppressive religious minds that are out there. So I think there are people on both sides who like the argument.
Because Jesus rode a dinosaur.
Right, and yeah, right, that kind of thing. And, they like to get big public debates. And I love Bill Nye, by the way. But I would see him as an example in that Ken Ham.
Oh, yeah, that was
right.
awful, though.
So, here's two guys
that
are having a debate that neither one of them wants to have, at least partially because they get to promote themselves and their organizations and maybe bring in some money and some funding. So I do think that to some extent it's created because it's making some people a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay.
Most people, I think, are just kind of muddy about it. They're kind of like, well, science is okay and religion is okay, and they don't realize that there are many places in which science and religion ultimately come into conflict. And for me, accepting religion as it exists in the Bible, Christianity, it's hard for me to understand how someone can reconcile that with the scientific viewpoint. Because the scientific viewpoint argues that many of the things that God claims to do or claims to have done are not possible and could not be done.
Such as?
Well, you can't do things without there being a reaction.
But how do you know He didn't create that reaction?
What do you mean?
Well, let's talk about the Big Bang Theory, which, by the way, I told you today that I read that there's some kind of debate about. I don't know if it's it is classified under the Big Bang Theory, but it's something about expansion. It's more about the expansion of the universe, and there was something against it. But anyway, so let's talk about the Big Bang Theory. So if we look at the Bible and it says that He created the earth and, He created light and yada, 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 then why is it not possible that God could have caused the Big Bang Theory, of which would then cause everything to be set in motion? Why is that necessary? How would you know what the mechanism of which a omnipotent being such as God would operate? For us being science-minded, then it would be the Big Bang Theory, but for him, it would be,
It's not impossible, just irrelevant.
Well, why is it irrelevant?
You can create, and
Can you make a Big Bang?
For the record, scientists cannot.
That's right.
But if you could create a mathematical model which explains the forces and the actions which were taking place in the initial few seconds of the universe.
But they can't do it.
And, well, they strive to do so.
With the Hadron
and
Collider.
always making progress.
With
the
Hadron,
LHC.
Yes.
But the point being, let's step back from the origin of the universe. Admittedly, cannot be explained. Okay, let's step back and look at something more simple, like disease. Now, disease was often seen as something under the province of God. God decided who got sick and who didn't, and that if you lived a virtuous life and you were a good person, you should be able to avoid disease, whereas people who caught diseases deserved it for some reason. This is what ancient man thought. Some of them. Okay, I mean, you can look back, guys like Galen and people like that who might, and even Nostradamus, who was, that sort of had an inkling, like a beginning of an inkling of bacteriology and what all that meant. But most people thought it was under the province of God. So then scientists come along and are able to discover that in fact it's not being cursed by God that gets you sick. It's coming in contact with these little bacteria and the viruses and things like that. So therefore, God's direct intervention is no longer necessary.
Okay, but doesn't that
because
but
we now have a
science
system of thought
but
which can completely explain why this person gets sick and that
okay, but
person
doesn't
didn't.
but if you want to go that route, doesn't science explain that too? Because if we look back hundreds of years ago, weren't the brain casings of people who had these kind of ideas relatively small, which would therefore mean that they were not very intelligent, therefore means that they would have such ridiculous viewpoints, whereas now we have larger brain cases because we've evolved. Therefore,
Supposedly, right?
right, so therefore that, that was more, again, coming back to the point that we spoke about in the first video, whereas it is people who put these negative connotations, and if they actually followed the Bible, then it wouldn't be that way at all. I mean, that actually goes with science, right? If you look back hundreds of years, right, and they in fact say that now we are evolving again, and our brain cases are getting even larger, which corresponds, by the way, I believe we spoke about with the prevalence of violence now that we are seeing more and more often, even though statistically they say there's not as much violence, right?
Far less.
Far less. But
Far
I
less. I
guess
mean, there's some charts out there. You should check
right,
it out. I mean,
right. Oh, I should I check it out?
enormously.
Enormously, huh?
People dying from violent conflict has plunged through
Right.
the floor.
But they're saying, I guess, the violence, the amount of violence of these crimes, the actual extreme violence of the crimes, they're saying. Uh,
We're going to get cut off
we're
again.
gonna get cut off again.
Yes. So, this was our video on debating religion. I'm making the argument that religion, in fact, does not deliver.
And
It has a lot of positive aspects, but ultimately it's unpredictable, whereas science is based on predictability. You want to know that if I do X, Y, then Z will be the result. And you can know that with empirical thought and natural law.
and I'm saying that Christianity definitely, if used correctly, and powers are not used for, their powers are used for good instead of evil, can be a very positive impact on society as large.
That's a different debate, whether or not Christianity actually drives people to lead virtuous and good lives.
And that Jesus does not like him. He believes that he is a mean man, and if you were back in the 1500s, and if you were going to be
Vishnu
punished
likes
by
me. We were hanging out just
Vishnu
the other week.
does not like you.
Vishnu and me we're like that.
Vishnu does not like you. And if you were back in the 1500s, you would basically have no arms and legs and look like a coal mining stump because you would be punished for all your horrible sins.
That's probably true.
I agree completely. So he has probably won this debate because he sounds super smart, because he's a nerd.
It's really all an act.
It's nerd. But anyway, we'll think of something else to do, and we'll put it on here. And if you guys don't like it, well, I'm snarky, so I don't care. Okay. Bye-bye.